It's been a while since I've seen one of these 5 questions for atheist things, but somebody sent me a link to a Peter Williams video called 5 Flaws in the Thinking of the New Atheists. So let's go through some of these flaws. The New Atheists repeatedly misunderstand and mischaracterize the nature of faith as it's understood within the majority of the Christian tradition. Time and time again they say that faith is, by definition, belief without evidence, or belief in the teeth of evidence to the contrary, and that therefore faith is irrational. Well, if that's what faith meant, I would agree with them. However, they're just wrong about this. Faith does not mean blind faith or faith in the teeth of evidence to the contrary. I would say that a good modern translation for what we mean by faith in the Christian tradition is simply trust. That we trust God, we trust Jesus, and trust can of course be based upon very good reasons for having that trust. So there is no definitional contradiction between faith and reason. Well, faith is not just irrational if you have no evidence, it's also irrational if you have insufficient evidence. If you prefer to call that trust, okay, fine, but what reason do you have to trust that the supernatural is real? Claims about the paranormal are, by definition, extraordinary claims, and trusting that paranormal claims are true is irrational without extraordinary evidence. We see natural phenomena all the time, so it's perfectly rational to trust claims about natural phenomena if we have good evidence. But since supernatural phenomena have never been demonstrated to occur, believing in supernatural claims is not rational if all you have is good evidence. Believing in those claims is only rational if you have massive amounts of evidence. My second point would be that the New Atheists want to champion rationality. This of course comes off the back of their misplaced critique of Christian beliefs as blind faith, and instead of that they want to champion the value of rationality. But when you actually examine the account of reason and rationality that they put forward as a positive characterization of rationality, I think that you find huge philosophical issues. So the New Atheists tend to focus on a very narrow understanding of rationality. Like, it's only rational to believe things if you've got scientific or empirical evidence in its favor. Well, take that kind of rule of rationality and try and apply it to itself. What is their evidence or their scientific data to back up the truth of that claim about when it's rational to believe things? Well, there isn't any, because it isn't a scientific claim. It's not an empirical claim. It's a purely philosophical claim, and one that contradicts itself. I would agree with this argument if we said that empiricism is true, or empiricism reveals truth. But we don't say that. All we say is that beliefs based on evidence work when we take those beliefs and apply them to practical circumstances. If an idea does not work or cannot be applied to some practical circumstance, then we don't say it's false necessarily. We just say that it's useless. There's no point in believing in it. If a belief produces no practical, empirically verifiable predictions, it is an utterly pointless belief. I don't know about you, but in my opinion, doing pointless things is pretty irrational. Thirdly, I'd make the point that the New Atheists are constantly making a moral critique of religious believers, and particularly a moral critique of the irrationality or supposed irrationality of faith and so on. They want to call people to live up to rationality as they see it, and they see this as some sort of moral imperative, it would seem. They want us to live up to our intellectual obligations, but this moral critique and this moral call to rationality really doesn't square with the New Atheists' own view of the nature of morality. So Richard Dawkins, for example, will explicitly say that he thinks that there is no such thing as good or evil in an objective sense. But how can you call upon people to live up to their objective moral obligations to be reasonable if you don't think that there are any such things as objective moral obligations in the first place? Well, the atheists who say that there is no objective morality are not the ones telling you that you have objective moral obligations. I don't believe in objective morality, and I wouldn't tell you that. However, I believe that there are behaviors and beliefs that are healthy. That is, they can be empirically demonstrated to contribute to human survival and prosperity. And there are behaviors that are pathological. That is, they can be empirically demonstrated to undermine human survival and prosperity. Now, you are under no objective moral obligation to choose healthy behavior over pathological behavior. But because pathological behavior is something that people generally try to avoid, they usually appreciate it when it is pointed out. And we criticize religious folks for believing in things without sufficient evidence because we see that doing so is pathological. So I wouldn't say that religious folks do things that are objectively morally wrong, but I can say that many things that religious folks do are pretty sick, and we can empirically demonstrate that they are sick. For example, refusing to take your kids to the doctor because you would rather pray their illness away. Fourthly, and kind of staying in the same kind of field as the point I was making about the New Atheists' account of morality, is when you start thinking about the issue of responsibility and free will. German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that there was an inextricable link between having freedom of will and having moral responsibility for your actions and so on. And so on some occasions it clearly clearly seems that the new atheists are calling upon people to exercise the freedom to make better choices about what they believe in life, and calling on us to think harder and put more effort into it and be more reasonable and so on. And this, as well as a moral critique, involves the assumption that we have the freedom to do these things that they can call upon us to exercise. But again, on the other hand, if you look into the new atheists' account of human nature, you'll find people like Richard Dawkins very clearly saying that people don't really have free will. We're just machines composed of atoms. We dance to the music of our DNA interacting with our environment, and so on. Not all of the new atheists deny free will, but I do, and I think your reasoning here is actually quite backward. When religious folk follow religious dogma, that dogma is one of the many factors that have a causal, deterministic influence over their thinking and behavior. When I criticize religious people for not considering ideas that are contrary to that dogma, I'm not telling them to exercise their free will. Rather, I'm trying to put ideas in their minds that will be among the many considerations that will exert a causal, deterministic influence over their thinking. I'm trying to alter their way of thinking such that they consider a wider variety of ideas, because I believe that doing so is beneficial. Some people who believe in free will say, if there's no free will, there's no point in trying to influence people's decisions, because they're just predetermined to do whatever it is they're predetermined to do, and there's nothing that you can say that will change that. But that's like saying, well, if computers have no free will, then there's no point in trying to program them, because they're just predetermined to do whatever it is they're going to do, regardless of what program you give them. This is obviously a very silly criticism of determinism. When I criticize religious folk, I do not assume that they have free will. Quite the opposite. I assume that my criticisms will be among the many considerations that exert a causal influence over their thinking and behavior. Fifthly, I would point out that the new atheists really fail to do their homework on issues of central concern to their writing and speaking. For example, Richard Dawkins, of all the new atheists, spends the most time and effort interacting with the arguments for the existence of God and trying to give arguments against the existence of God. But even he who spends the most time on the subject out of all the new atheist writers will, for example, interact with the arguments of Thomas Aquinas, a very famous philosopher, theologian, and Christian history, and will critique his arguments for believing in God without even quoting from him. And what he ends up doing is actually misrepresenting the arguments and just attacking a strawman version of these arguments for God, and ridicules things that he gives no indication, in his work at least, that he's actually done any serious research or thinking about. I'll give you this one. Dawkins is not a philosopher. There are some great scientists who are masters of their own fields who are just completely lost when they try to talk about philosophy. Although I wouldn't really say that that's the case for Dan Dennett or Sam Harris. But I don't think that this is a problem inherent to atheism or the atheist movement. There is certainly no shortage of religious folk who try to make scientific arguments against evolution when they clearly don't understand evolution, and those who try to argue that various cosmological theories are evidence for God when they clearly don't understand those theories. And given the number of straw men you have just thrown out, Mr. Williams, I don't really think that you are completely innocent of this either.